ready now. Governor, you were born in Augusta in 1925. How long had your family lived in that area?
Well, my immediate family had lived there for, I'd say 30 or 40 years. My mother had lived there all of her life practically. My father had moved to Augusta from Rex, Georgia, Clayton County, south of Atlanta, when he went to work with Swift and Company, and he'd been there, I guess, when I was born, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Did your father work with Swift his entire life?
My father worked with Swift and Company his entire life. He went to work with Swift and Company at an early age. He was in his teens. He, I guess, first joined them, he must have, here in Atlanta, and then they transferred him to Augusta. And he worked with Swift for 40 full years, and I'd say about 40-odd years of it was right in Augusta.
Did your mother also work?
My mother worked. My mother's mother was a widow, and my mother worked as a bookkeeper for the S.H. Crescent Company. I've always admired the fact that back in those days, of course, they didn't have calculators and things of that kind, and she could sit down and add up a column of figures about as fast as you could do it on a calculator. But she helped, she was in the bookkeeping department of the company, and she worked there until she married my father.
Mm-hmm. I suppose that growing up during the Depression years meant that your family had very few frills or luxuries, but I've read that you had an exceptionally happy and secure childhood. Would you explain why you felt that way?
Well, I never really felt the real pressures of the Depression, although I think I was aware of it in the sense that when I was about 4 or 5 years old, we moved from my grandmother's home, which had been located in downtown Augusta. We moved to a new brick bungalow which had been built at the corner of Johns Road, Johns Road, and Wrightsboro Road in Augusta, Georgia. I entered the kindergarten at the Montesana Grammar School, which was about 3 blocks away, and I spent my entire elementary school years in that school. I had a wonderful time. I was very active in that school. My mother was active in the PTA.
Excuse me, Governor. Mr. Hinkle said that you were expecting him for just a moment.
My mother was president of the PTA, and I became captain of the schoolboy patrol. We had schoolboy patrolmen who would direct traffic, kids going to school. And I also, at that point, of course, got active in the YMCA at Augusta. At that point, the Y was providing all of the athletic programs rather than the schools. That's where I learned how to play football and basketball, and I learned how to swim, and I went to Y camps in the summertime. They were inexpensive, but they were great camps because they were really led by dedicated professional people, YMCA professionals, who, as I look back on my life and remember those men, I think about how much they really meant. They were building character in young boys, and they were doing it in a fashion that I have never forgotten that. Now, as far as the Depression was concerned, the thing I remember most vividly about that was the fact that after we had lived in that home for about a year or so, my father's salary, like everybody else's salary, was cut in half. He was lucky because he kept his job, but he had his salary cut in two, and instead of buying the house as we had started out to do, we had to, in effect, start renting the house and had to turn the house, I guess, back to the insurance company or the bank who at the time had made the loan on it. We lived in that house, continued to live in it until I was about, I'd finished grammar school and got ready to enter Richmond Academy, which of course was the high school, the boys' high school in Augusta at that time, and we moved up to a home at 2710 Helen Street, which was further up on the hill, as they call the residential section in Augusta. And I lived, and my mother still lives in that home today. But that was a small story-and-a-half bungalow, and we, of course, enjoyed that. My father was a very good man when it came to his family. He obviously was not an athlete. I don't think he was in his day. He was a big man. He weighed well over 200 pounds. And the only sport I've ever known him to participate in was that he played a little golf. Very little, but he had a set of left-handed golf clubs. Ironically, he was right-handed and played golf left-handed. I'm left-handed and play golf right-handed. But anyway, he played golf, I think, with a few of the people that he worked with at the plant and all. And I developed, I guess, my taste or my thirst for athletics from the YMCA. But he supported that, and my mother supported that in the sense that she saw to it that I got to the Y when I was supposed to, and he saw to it that I was able to participate by getting me the basic equipment that whatever I needed, whether it was a basketball or whether it was a football or whether it was a baseball glove or a bat. He saw to it that my brother and I had the necessary equipment to participate. The other thing that he enjoyed doing, which we did with him, was he did like to fish. He had a couple of friends that owned a couple of fish ponds, primarily down around Waynesboro, which is 25 miles south of Augusta. And he would take my brother and I down there, especially in the spring when the brim were bedding, and we would catch fish. And of course, and I enjoyed that, and he enjoyed it. I remember that we caught so many one time that we had a string of them that was so long that we went by the Augusta Sporting Goods, which was a little store on 8th Street that I got acquainted with because I'd buy my Y uniforms there and whatnot, and we had the newspaper take a picture of the big string of fish that we'd caught, and they put it in the paper. I grew up, as I say, without any great frills. My mother, and still is, one of the most wonderful, saintly people that I have ever known. She was her standards of morality and her standards of just relating to other people as human beings are the highest I've ever seen. She got along with everybody. She still does. She's one of the kindest persons I've ever known. She sacrificed, and I knew this, in a lot of ways so that I could do things that perhaps she had not done. I say I, my brother and I. I know that there was a program in Augusta at that time when young people got to be teenagers where they taught social dancing and in effect taught social manners. That was done at the YWCA. It was conducted by a wonderful woman by the name of Mrs. Price, who lived to be about 90-something years old, and she taught me many social graces that I doubt seriously if I would have learned if I had not been a part of her program. But my mother saw to it that my brother and I both were entered into that program. We learned social dancing, we learned social manners, we learned that how you were supposed to dress and what you were supposed to do when you were in the company of young ladies. And I learned how to waltz and foxtrot. I learned how to not chew my chewing gum when I went to a social function, and I learned how to conduct myself as a young man should in the presence of a young woman. That was done probably at the expense of my mother getting a new dress or having being able to buy some things that she could have used for her own self. But she, rather than spend money on herself, she spent that money on her two sons, her children. She had no help in the house. She did her own housework and her own cooking. She prepared wonderful meals for my family. My father being employed at Swift & Company. We didn't have a lot of money because Swift didn't pay any huge salaries, but we ate well because Swift & Company would allow its employees to buy meat at cost like any other company would. And of course we were able to enjoy some of the finer, cuts of beef and other things at Swift hams and other things that people, I'm sure, would like to have enjoyed growing up. So I had a good family relationship. I had a good stable home life. I went to school, and my mother saw to it that I did my homework, and I also when I was not in school, I was engaged in some activity that was productive and beneficial. And I, grew up in a neighborhood where there were a lot of kids, and we had a lot of neighborhood participation. I mean, we played football in the front yards. We played cowboy and Indians down in the woods, not too far from the area that we lived, which back in those days was known as the King's Woods. We skated in the some of the streets. They used to block off a block up on Heath Street, and we would have hockey games on skates, go down in the woods and make a sassafras hockey stick by bending a tree and lighting the fire underneath it until it would make a hockey stick. And just a variety of really great experiences that I think any child should have growing up. It was just a well-balanced combination of good, clean fun and good schooling and some good, wonderful family relations in the home that I lived in.
What about church activities? Were they stressed in
I
your
was
youth?
active in the church. My mother stressed those. I went to Sunday school regularly every Sunday. She saw to it that my brother and I went to Sunday school, and we not only went to Sunday school, but later on I would go to the BYPU, as they called it, which was the Baptist version of the young people's activities on Sunday evening. I was also involved with not only the YMCA, but I was involved with the Boy Scouts. I went into the Scout program. I became a first-class Scout. I participated in that program. Later on in life, when I went back to Augusta to practice law, I conducted all of the courts of honor for the Scout program in the Georgia-Carolina region. Even today, I serve on the advisory board for the Metropolitan Scout region here in Atlanta. I still serve on the Metropolitan YMCA board in Atlanta. So the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, the church, and the home activities were all part of my life and something that I grew up in. I was baptized in the Hill Baptist Church along with my brother when I guess I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And I taught Sunday school, of course, in that church. I later taught Sunday school up here. I probably taught Sunday school 25 years in my lifetime, and still do on occasion. So the church has been an integral part of my life. The YMCA has been an integral part of my life. The Boy Scout program has been a part of my life, and the home with my mother and my father and my brother, living in a stable home, has also been a very important part of my life.
I know you did odd jobs such as delivering newspapers and bagging groceries and along with these other things, but you must have had time to study too, since you earned an alternate appointment to West Point.
Well, I studied, but I was not what I would call a book fiend, or one who devoted a great deal of time to studying. I did my homework. I guess I was fortunate. I seemed to have the ability to keep up with what I needed to keep up with and still have plenty of time to do other things. I did work at various jobs. I did that, and I'm delighted I did that, because I think it inculcated into me a work ethic that I still have today, and that is that I feel like that unless I'm working and unless I'm doing something that I feel like is productive, I almost feel guilty when I'm not doing it. I started out, as you pointed out, carrying newspapers. Did that in the summertime first, so it didn't really interfere too much with my school, because I was out of school. But I carried the morning paper. I'd have to get up early in the morning and then go up and get the papers and fold them and then take them on the route, throw them, and then get back and get ready and go to school. Later on in my life, my father, of course, being with Swift & Company, he had good connections with the people that ran the big supermarkets and things. I went to work on the weekend at the Big Star grocery store in Augusta, down on the corner of about 8th and Green. And I would work there on a Saturday. I'd go to work about 7 o'clock in the morning, and we generally got through about 9, and by the time it was 9 o'clock at night, Reed Robinson, who was the manager and a friend of my father's, would take me home, and he'd always stop by the railroad station over there. They had a restaurant, and have a cup of coffee. So I'd get home about 10:30 at night on Saturday, and maybe I had made $6 or $7 that day. It was a lot of money to me back in that day and time. I worked there. I worked when I was in college. I'd come home on Christmas holidays, and I would work and some in high school, I worked as a substitute mail carrier during the holidays. When I was in high school at Richmond Academy, they selected some of the cadets to go out and work at the Masters Golf Tournament each year. I worked there selling tickets and collecting money right at the gate, handling money and making sure that you balanced all of that out. When I went to college, I was on a football scholarship. Even at the football dormitory, I used to sell corsages, flowers and things that represented one of the florists up in Athens, and if there were any corsages that were needed for the dances for the girls and things, I'd provide them and get a commission for that. So I've worked practically all my life. I told you I went to the Y camps as a small kid, and I did. I went to Camp Wiley down at Savannah. I went up to Camp Stevens, which was in Crawfordville, Georgia, and I went to several other YMCA camps. When I got into high school and I became very active on the football and basketball teams at Richmond Academy. My coaches were going to a couple of camps that I could not have afforded because they were what I would call camps for rich young boys. One of them was Camp Dixie up at Clayton, Georgia, where they had horseback riding and things of that kind. The other one was Red Baron's camp over at Mountain City. And my football coach was named Wendell Sullivan, and he was one of the staff members on that camp. So he asked that I go up there and be a counselor, and that provided me with camping opportunities where I was a counselor for some of the young kids, and I got my camping free. Otherwise, I would not have been able to go there. But by going there and getting acquainted with some of the people who ran those camps, it was a wonderful man. It was in the educational system here in Fulton County by the name of Dr. Willis Sutton. He and a fellow named Pop Jameson ran the Camp Dixie for boys, and there were boys that went to that camp from all over the southern part of the country, including Texas. So it exposed me to some opportunities there that I would not have been exposed to otherwise. Red Baron was one of the great football greats at Georgia Tech, and he had this camp at Mountain City, and I went there one year. So although I was going to camp, I was working too, because I was earning my way by counseling young kids from other parts of the state. So I guess all my life I have had a job of some kind or another since I was 10 or 12 years old.
Was it your goal to have a military career at that time?
No, it was not my goal, but I happened to be, of course, at the Richmond Academy High School, and that was a military high school. It was a public school, but it was a wonderful school. They had great faculty people there. They had a junior college that was attached to it, and some of the people that served in the college faculty also taught in the high school. But we had to wear uniforms, and we had to do all of the participate in all of the military training from the time you entered. I was president of my freshman class. I got elected president of the freshman class when I entered high school. I became proficient in military. I think I was either made a corporal or sergeant the first year in high school. I later became a company commander and later became one of the top military people in high school. And of course, because of that strict ROTC training, wearing the uniforms, keeping my shoes and my brass all polished except for one day a week, which was Thursday, I think it was, that we were allowed to wear civilian clothes. Otherwise, you had to wear the uniform. And we, had a weekly parade, and we became very proficient with the old Springfield rifle. And then later, we, of course, as an officer, you wore saber, and you became proficient with all of the military drills. I found that later on in life, when I went into the service, of course, I was so far ahead of the average civilian who'd never had any military training, and it just propelled me to leadership positions in the service that I would not have probably been able to serve in had I not had that training. I had no intention to have a military career, but the war was coming along. I got to my senior year in high school, which was 1942 when I finished, and I got interested in the fact that we were about to go into a war, it looked like. So I got interested into applying for an appointment to West Point. Paul Brown was a congressman for the 10th District. My father knew him, but not on a real intimate political basis. But my father had some friends there in Augusta who were political supporters of Brown, and I applied for the appointment to West Point. I got an alternate appointment. He gave me the first alternate appointment to West Point. The principal appointment went to a young man by the name of Sewell Elliott, who was the son of the mortician, Elliott Brothers, Elliott Brothers Mortuary. He was at the Citadel, and I thought that he would, upon graduation, that he would take his commission from the Citadel and go on into the service. So I came up to Fort McPherson, where they gave me a physical for the West Point, also gave me the mental exam. I took the written exam, I took the physical, I passed them both. But instead of Sewell Elliott going into the service, he decided to go to West Point. He took the principal appointment, and therefore I was without an appointment. I was then in Georgia at the University of Georgia as a freshman. So it was shortly after that that I decided to enlist in the service because I thought I was going to be drafted. I first came over to Atlanta and applied for the Naval Air Corps. I was accepted. They told me, however, I had to go back to Augusta and get my parents' consent because I was too young. I was 16 years old, 17, I guess it was 17, and you had to be 18 years old or better at that time to go in without your parents' consent. I went home. I got thinking about flying out over the ocean, trying to land on those carriers. I decided I didn't want to do that, so I went home to Augusta. I talked to my parents. I went out and joined the Army Air Corps and enlisted at Daniel Field, Augusta, Georgia, and was accepted. Went back to the University of Georgia, was called into the service a couple of months later.
Okay, and you were commissioned to fly B-17s, I believe, at age 19.
I was commissioned.
Wasn't that unusual to be a pilot at that age?
Well, it really wasn't unusual back in those days. In those days, it was that's what the war was all about. I mean, everybody that I knew that was in the service was 19, 20, 21 years old. They were all young people. We'd all either enlisted. Of course, people that I was with, they all had enlisted because they went into the Aviation Cadet Corps and then went into flying school, either went into navigation, bombardiering, or pilot school. But I was a first pilot, selected for first pilot on a B-17, and as I said, one of the reasons, I guess it was, that when I was in the Cadet Corps, I was a wing commander of the Aviation Cadet Corps when I was in primary at Visalia, California. I was also one of the top cadet officers as I went through the flying school, mainly because I knew more military than 99% of the other guys who were in there. And so when I graduated, I was sort of given, I guess, opportunities to go to first pilot school rather than go to co-pilot school, which some of the other people went to.
Did you see much combat in the war?
Didn't see a lot of combat in the war because as the war came down to an end there, I had a choice of either going on and spending 4 more years in the Air Force or getting out of the Air Force and coming back and going to school, and I chose to return and get out of the Air Force. I went through, mustered out of Fort McPherson, which was a mustering out here in September of 1945.
Mm-hmm. Okay, after the war, you returned to Athens, completed your law degree, passed the bar, played football, participated in social and professional fraternity activities, and received numerous honors. It must have been a very hectic period to do all of that.
Didn't seem to be hectic at the time. I guess if I look back on it, I would say it was a pretty hectic period. But when I came back to the University of Georgia, I immediately joined the football team, which I had been I'd been to Georgia on a football scholarship. That's how I got to the University of Georgia in the first place. I had made the all GIAA high school football team before the war, and they had awarded me a scholarship to the University of Georgia where they paid my room, board, tuition, and gave us $10 a month spending money. I went, of course, after the war. When I came back, I had the GI Bill, which every veteran had, but I wanted to play football again, so I rejoined the varsity football team in the fall of 1945. I played that season with Charlie Trippi and others. I went to the Oil Bowl, which is now the Bluebonnet Bowl, in Houston, Texas, and we beat Tulsa and won that game. While I was at the same time, I was thinking about entering law school. And of course, when I returned to the campus at the University of Georgia, one of the things that the colleges were then permitting was for any returning veteran to take as many tests that he could take in any field of educational field that he might have been exposed to while he was in the service. And if he could pass the exams, they'd give you college credit. So due to the fact that a lot of the pilot training that I had taken involved math and physics and some other courses of that kind, I went into service, which was just during my freshman year. I accumulated enough college credits by taking those exams to where I only needed a few more hours to be eligible to go to law school. So I played football that fall. I also applied for the law school. I took some basic courses in economics and I've forgotten what else. And I was accepted to the law school for entrance as a freshman beginning in the January of 1946, which I guess would have been the fall quarter. So when the football season was over and I returned from the Oil Bowl, which we played we played January 1st, 1946, I still was on a football scholarship, and I was going to try to go out for spring practice and stay in law school at the same time. I realized as soon as I started attending law school classes that it was going to be awfully difficult for me to keep up with my law school requirements and still play football for the University of Georgia. So I went to see Coach Butts and told him that I was going to quit the athletic program. I had been living in the football dormitory with all the other players, and I told him that, and I moved out into a home out on Springdale Street. Mrs. McNabb had a house out there in which she rented rooms to 4, 5, 6 law students, and I moved out there that spring and, of course, started my law school. Law school is normally, as you know, a 3-year course. They were allowing people who had, we were the largest class, law class in the history of the law school at that time, because there were so many returning veterans who were coming back into law school, plus just civilian students who had never gone to the service. But they allowed us to go year-round rather than drop out for the summer quarter like you normally would do. And so I actually went around the clock for 2 years and made up 3 years of law school in 2 years. So I really got my law degree. I finished my law degree in December of 1947. I did not pick up my diploma until June of 48, because that's when they had the graduation exercise. But I also took the bar exam, which was something that they don't allow you to do now, but they did then. You could take the bar exam whether you had finished your law degree or not, and I went over and took the bar exam in the summer, early spring of 47, and I passed the bar exam before I actually finished my law degree, which was in December of that year. I got married after that. I had been going with my wife, who I met when I returned to the campus at the University of Georgia after the war. I decided to get married in September of 47, because I knew then that I was going to finish law school at the end of the year, and I also knew that I had passed the bar exam, so I was going to be able to practice law, and I wasn't going to have to look for a job, because I had made a connection with a law firm in Augusta, and I knew that when I finished in December that they would hire me when I came home. So I kind of pushed all that together in a short period of time, but I guess when I look back on it now, it seems to be rather hectic, but at that time it didn't seem to be quite that hectic.
I've seen different versions about how you met Betty Foy. Was it a blind date, or were you just hanging around, or how did you actually meet her?
No, it was really not exactly a blind date. I had been dating a girl down at the Chi Omega House, which was located out on Millage Road in Athens, like where all the sorority houses were located. And she and I had a little misunderstanding one night about something, I don't even remember what. But she decided that she'd go upstairs and study, and I decided that I'd leave, so I left. And I went down the street to the Tridelt House, which was about a block down the street. And I went in, and interestingly enough, I've forgotten exactly how it occurred, but Betty Bird Foy, who was at that time a member of that sorority, I think I was downstairs sitting around either with a friend of mine or somebody talking, and she came downstairs and we got acquainted, and that's how we met. From that point on, I never went back to the Chi Omega House. I concentrated on the Tridelt House. And of course we began to go together regularly. She later I was a member of the Chi Phi fraternity, and so I took her over to the Chi Phi house, and she became the sponsor for the Chi Phi fraternity. I guess the last year we were in school, and as I said, our romance flourished, and we got married. She went to Georgia while I was in the service. She went up there and she was in the art school, and she'd finished her art degree earlier, I guess maybe the end of 46 or the spring of 47, I'm not sure which. And of course we got married about 6 months later after she had already graduated, and I was in the process of finishing up my law degree.
Shortly after your marriage, didn't she become seriously ill?
She became seriously ill. She developed a condition. Well, first of all, she she got slightly ill right before we got married, and then she developed this intestinal condition. Nobody seemed to know what it was, what caused it, and it just debilitated her to the point where she got very ill. And at one point, after we had been married, I'd say within about 6 months, 8 months after that, she was so sick, we had to put her in the hospital in Statesboro at the time. And the local doctor there, told me that he didn't think she was going to live, which I just couldn't believe. But it was a very, very serious time. She came through that, and that's when I really learned the power of prayer, because I just prayed as I'd never prayed before, even when I was in the service. And she recovered enough to where we then went to Dr. Seinstricker in Augusta, who was on the staff at the medical college, and asked him to try, and he was a very famous diagnostician, asked him to try to determine what the condition was. He recommended that I take her to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. So I flew her up to Baltimore, Maryland. We went through the Johns Hopkins University there, stayed about a week. They ran her through every test they could think of. We came back, and Dr. Seinstricker, from the report that he'd gotten from Johns Hopkins University, determined that she had a rare form of what they call regional ileitis, which was an inflammation of the intestinal tract. They still don't know what it's caused from. It could be caused from the germs from that you get in certain types of milk. And Betty, of course, had grown up in Bullock County in Statesboro. She had lived on a big farm a good part of her life and all, and some of that could have developed from some of the dairy products and things that she was drinking back in those days. But finally, she had to have an operation in which they removed a section of her intestine which had been infected and inflamed, and after that she, of course, her health was restored, and she was able then to resume a normal life. And although we had been told up until that point, we'd been married, I guess, at that point 4 or 5 years, that she may not ever have any children. Fortunately, after about 5 years of married life, we had a little girl, and then I guess somewhat to her surprise and mine, we had a little boy about 17 months after that. So we had 2 children, and they, of course, have been wonderful children, and that's pretty well the way we got started out in married life. When I got married and I went back to Augusta and started practicing law, I also had another job, and that is I taught law school at night. I'd practice law all day in the law firm, and then I'd go teach 3 nights a week. I'd teach the corporations, and I taught insurance law and some other courses in the Augusta Law School, which was made up of some returning veterans there, some military personnel from out at the Fort Gordon, and some civilians. So I was working 2 jobs, trying to make sure that I could pay some of these medical bills. Back when she was so sick, they prescribed some rather strong antibiotic medicines, and they were expensive, and I had to buy those and pay for those and try to keep our home life going, and it was a struggle.
Has she enjoyed good health since that period?
She has enjoyed good health since that period, yes. The only problems that she's had is that several years ago she developed some problems with her knee, but some of that goes all the way back to where I think she hurt her knee when she was in high school playing basketball.
When you began to practice law, who was your partner? What firm did you practice
Well,
with?
the firm I practiced law in was a firm, it was Hammond and Kennedy when I went down there, which was made up of principally Judge Henry C. Hammond, who had been a Superior Court judge and was a character out of this world, and Fred Kennedy, who later became a Superior Court judge, but who was at that time just a good trial lawyer. So I went in as the associate in that law firm, and after a year or so I was made a partner, and the firm then was known as Hammond, Kennedy, and Sanders. And of course I worked strictly as a lawyer. I didn't have any political aspirations, and I didn't have any time for politics. For about 5 years all I did was just keep my head buried in the law library and in the courts and work like the devil, because Judge Kennedy was a very exacting taskmaster. Judge Hammond was basically retired, but his name was still on the letterhead and all, but he was up in his, I guess when I went to work for him, he's probably 75, close to 80 years old. And anyway, we had a good law practice, and I worked very hard, and he worked me very hard, and it was 5 years later before I was importuned to consider politics. My father had in the meantime had what I would call a slight political career, in that he had been elected county commissioner for Richmond County, and he served as a county commissioner for, I don't know, 4 years. I didn't think much of that job because that's a pretty thankless job. Everybody wants you to fix their driveway or cut a road or get rid of the trash or something, and they just worried the devil out of anybody who served in those offices. But Augusta and Richmond County back in those days was pretty much in the clutch of political clutch of what was known as the Cracker Party. And ironically, I guess my father and the other county commissioners who had been elected were elected originally on that kind of a ticket. That's the only way you could get elected. But some of the young veterans and other people had decided that they ought to break up this Cracker Party political domain, which was run by a fellow named Chief Kennedy, no relation to Fred Kennedy, who was my law partner, but who was the chief of the fire department and later became the public safety commissioner. So they put together, the friends of mine and all, put together a party called the Independent Party. And the Independent Party was mostly young war veterans and all, and that party then broke up the Cracker Party. And I was asked by a couple of the older lawyers, one primarily Mr. Joe Cummings of Augusta, who was a very distinguished lawyer, senior partner in another law firm, not mine, if I would consider running for the House of Representatives. I was going to run in the place of a friend of mine, a lawyer by the name of John Bell, who was going to run for judge. And I talked to my wife and discussed it with some of my friends and all, and decided to run. And I was elected to the House of Representatives. 1900, I took office in, I guess, 1955. So that was really 10 years. When I took office, I'd started practicing law in Augusta in 48, so it wasn't 10 years, so that was about 7 years. I'd been active in the practice when I first went to the legislature.
Had you started a new law firm by that time?
I started a law firm about that same time. About that same time, Judge Kennedy, just before that, I guess, Judge Kennedy decided that he wanted to go on the Superior Court bench. So he, with my help and other people there, they created a new judgeship, and he got the appointment to the Superior Court. Then when he left, I started my own firm. Actually, I took in a couple of young lawyers, one C.B. Thurman, and the other one Glenn B. Hester, and they were associates. I just shared office space with them, and I decided after a year that we'd form a partnership, and so I formed a partnership of Sanders, Thurman, and Hester. And of course, when Judge Kennedy left, he left me with the office up there in the Southern Finance Building. I didn't know whether I could even pay the rent. I was really concerned about whether I could carry out all of those, take on all those expenses. I bought the books from the library that he had. I paid him for those. I went down to the bank and borrowed a little money and paid for those, and I took over the office space, and I brought in these two lawyers, and I shared the offices with them for about a year, and then I entered into the partnership with them. But I found it was one of the first experiences that I found that I could do it on my own. I could have gone to any other law firm in Augusta. When Judge Kennedy went on the bench, they would love to have had me as his former partner in their law firm, but I decided that I'd be better off plowing my own furrow, trying to sail my own boat, than I would be to go over and join another law firm. So that's how I started my own law firm.
All right, after serving one term in the House, you were then elected to the Senate in 56 and 58 and in 1960. What were your chief legislative interests during that period?
Well, and when I went to the Senate, I, of course, served one term in the House, and I realized that the leadership in the House of Representatives was pretty well set. I enjoyed my 2 years there. I got acquainted with all the people who were running the House of Representatives. Of course, at that time, Marvin Griffin was the governor, and his floor leader had been in law school with me, and that was Denmark Groover. So although I was not one of the supporters of the then governor, I knew his floor leader well, and I got to be pretty active as a legislator. I sponsored some legislation. I made some speeches. I had been on the debating team at one point at Georgia. I'd even gone out for the debating team and gotten on that, so I didn't have any problem with getting started. Then the senatorial situation back in those days would rotate, and so the Senate seat rotated to Richmond County after my first term, and then I ran for the Senate, and I got elected. And of course, when I went to the Senate, Ernest Vandiver was the lieutenant governor, and I got acquainted with him. And my first appointment was chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. That was not something that I was particularly interested in, but it was because I was sort of a freshman senator, and some of the older senators who rotated around back in those days got the choicer committees. It turned out to be a rather fortuitous thing, though, because we got into a big brouhaha over some old National Guard planes that were being flown by pilots here in Georgia, and they were not airworthy, and one of them died or got killed in a crash, and I held a big investigation, and I got some notoriety and some publicity fairly early as a senator that I would not have gotten otherwise. As a result of me handling that, and as a result of being able to succeed myself the second time around, there was only one other senator in the Senate that was a permanent senator, and that was a senator from Fulton County. They had a permanent seat. Everybody else rotated. My district was the 18th back in that day and time, and it was made up of Glasscock, Jefferson, and Richmond County. Well, they allowed Richmond County, through some custom in politics, to serve 2 terms in the Senate. So I served first representing Richmond, and the second term, in effect, I was representing Jefferson County. There had never been a situation in Georgia where a county had waived its rights to nominate a senator or to have a person from that county serve as senator, but the third time around, Glasscock County waived their right to nominate a senator, and I was allowed to serve for 3 consecutive terms in the Senate, 6 years. This is something that is unprecedented, and something, of course, that probably had as much to do with me getting into a position to run for a higher office as anything that I know of. But I served my last term in the Senate as a senator representing Glasscock County. At that time I was also the floor leader for the governor for the Vandiver and that Vandiver had been elected to the governorship. Let's see, he got elected, I guess, in '58. And when he got elected, I supported Ernie Vandiver. So when I went back to the Senate, I became the floor leader. He appointed me as his floor leader, and I handled all of the legislation. And then later on, I was appointed the president pro tempore of the Senate, which I guess I took that job about 1959, about probably 1960, I guess it was. And so I served as both the floor leader and as the president pro tem of the Senate. One of the reasons that Vandiver gave me an opportunity to climb up in the leadership was that when I was in the Senate and he was a lieutenant governor, we got into this huge fight over there over the rural roads. Marvin Griffin was still governor, and he wanted to appropriate $100 million worth of bonds for rural roads, and it was being the money was to be pretty well allocated out, I think, to some contractors who were friends of the administration. So we had a big fight in the General Assembly, and they passed it through the House, and then we defeated it in the Senate. That pretty well ensured Vandiver's election as governor. Also, while he was governor, they had a big revolt by some of his friends in the House who tried to take the budget authority away from him, and I was able, as the president pro tem and as the floor leader, to defeat that in the Senate. So that pretty well ensured my leadership position in the General Assembly.
Georgia was a one-party state, but the Democratic Party has had several factions. We hear about the Carter faction or the Talmadge faction or others. How strong were these factions at that time, and what was your position?
Well, the Talmadge faction was still considered to be a pretty strong faction. Marvin Griffin had a faction, I guess, of his own. I was not a card-carrying member of either faction. I was sort of Johnny-come-lately, having come up from the so-called Independent Party in Augusta. Roy Harris, who was probably the most prominent politician in the Augusta area, was sort of on the other side of the political fence from me. So I wasn't, although I got along with him fine and got along fine with some of the people in the so-called Talmadge faction and all, they were not my supporters. I guess as I look back on it, I just happened to take advantage of what I considered to be some basic political issues that they were pushing in one direction. I didn't think that they were doing the right thing or pursuing the right position, and I came out of this leadership role in the Senate in the Vandiver's administration, but Ernest Vandiver, who's a friend of mine and continues to be, was not one of my early supporters for the race for governor. He had been pretty well committed to Garland Byrd, who was a lieutenant governor in his administration. And Garland Byrd, of course, was an avowed member of the so-called Talmadge faction. Marvin Griffin was the other, the former governor, was the candidate, the opposition, and he and his faction were really people who were made up of a little different group of people, and so I was neither fish nor fowl. I was sort of in between both of those factions and wasn't getting a great deal of encouragement or support from either one of them to do anything. Now, what happened to me is that we got into this question of keeping the public schools open during Vandiver's administration, and Vandiver was sort of very, very ambivalent about how he should approach this thing. he did the right thing, but in the final analysis, he listened to some people like Roy Harris, and even when he ran for governor, he made a speech in which he said, "No, not one, not ever one." He didn't have to do that, but Harris and some of them convinced him that he needed to do that in order to assure his election, which was against a fellow named Bill Bodenhammer from Ty, Georgia, who really was not in my opinion, was not a major candidate. But he got himself sort of positioned to where he was having to support 100% of all of the dyed-in-the-wool segregationist positions. I was not in that position. Because I was in a position of leadership in the Senate, I had been asked to go out on the Chamber of Commerce tour that they started back in those days to address some of the public issues of the state. When I went out on that tour with Frank Twitty, who was formerly had been the floor leader of the Talmadge administration in the House and who was still active. He was from Mitchell County down in Camilla, Georgia. Very able fellow, a very, very good speaker, and a rough and tumble legislator. And I knew that in my own mind I was thinking about if I ever wanted to run for statewide office, that some of the best experience that I could get would be to go out and engage in daily debates with a guy like Twitty, because I knew how able he was, and I figured that by the time we got through with the tour, if I was able to hold my own, that I ought to be able to do well with anybody. So we got out on that tour, and that was about the time when they started, the two people were going to enter the University of Georgia, two blacks, one of them being Charlene Hunter and the other one being Hamilton Holmes. And of course, all the old dyed-in-the-wool segregationists said, close the schools, shut them down, we don't need the university or public schools, we can set up these little private schools, we can also, if we have to, we can succeed from the union. All that kind of nullification, the principle of nullification got to be very popular again, where they just nullify all the federal laws and everything else. I realized that that was foolish, that was impractical. Shut the schools down, that was just absolutely the wrong thing to do, and some of these other people took the other position. I realized as I was moving around the state that the people of Georgia were not really too particularly interested in either Garland Byrd or Marvin Griffin, who were the two major candidates for the governor's race. At that point, I sort of had my sights set on thinking about running for lieutenant governor, which would have been the step up from the president pro tem to the lieutenant governor's office. I was probably going to have to compete head-on with Ernest Vandiver's executive secretary, who was Peter Zach Geer, and who wanted to run for lieutenant governor. And at that point, he had a few more organized politicians, professional politicians around the state that he probably could call on than I had. But I had more people. I didn't realize it, but I had more of the average citizen who I think believed in the things I was saying and the things that some of the other people were saying. So I was still trying to position myself to get into the race for lieutenant governor. And then, as usual in politics, strange things began to happen. And one of the things that happened was that when I let it be known that I was going to run for lieutenant governor, a guy by the name of Carl F. Sanders, who was a lawyer in Atlanta who I'd never heard of, showed up and said he was going to run for lieutenant governor. And I later found out that he'd been sort of sponsored by Peter Zach and some of his friends, which made it, virtually impossible for me. If I'd gone ahead with that race and his name had been on the ballot, my name had been on the ballot, people would have had to try to determine whether it was Carl E. or Carl F. they were going to vote for. So I sat down and thought about that and decided, after realizing that there wasn't a great groundswell for the governor's candidates and that those candidates were out there espousing positions and things that I felt was not in the best interest of the state, I then said, well, if that's the way they're going to play the game, then I'm going to run for governor. So I announced for governor. Well, when I announced for governor, pandemonium broke loose. All the people that had previously been supporting, I guess, Peter Zacharia and some of his friends came running to me and saying, look, you can't do this. We'll support you for lieutenant governor, but if you run for governor, we can't do that. You better stay in the lieutenant governor's race. Well, I thanked them, but told them that I'd made up my mind I was going to run for governor. And, of course, that was a mighty big step. I made that, I guess, if I had known later what all I was going to go through in the campaign and all of the problems of raising a lot of money and all that, I don't know whether I would have done that. But I did it. And, of course, it was the right thing at the right time, and that's what politics is all about. You can be the finest candidate in the world, the best qualified person in the world, but if you don't enter the political arena or seek the political office that you want, and if it isn't the right timing, you just wasting your time. I mean, you can't make it. But it was a tremendous interest at that time in what was going to happen to our state, what was going to happen to our educational system. I was 36 years old. I had experience in the House and the Senate. I was sort of like, I guess, a young lawyer from Augusta, Georgia, who had come out on a white horse and said, we're not going to tear up the educational institutions, we're not going to destroy the progress of Georgia, but we're going to try and moderate our positions and try to preserve our state and protect everybody in this state and not allow the federal government to take us over. And of course, that was the candidacy that I announced on. I later got involved as part of the campaign got to be a real tough, mean campaign. Marvin Griffin, of course, had had a previous administration that had been labeled by Reader's Digest and a lot of other people as being very corrupt, being very, very guilty of a lot of practices in government that you wouldn't be proud of. We got into that kind of a knockdown, drag-out. I became the quote-unquote, and I use this term advisedly because it was used, the nigger lover, because I stood up for public education, and he wanted to do away with the schools. And of course, he became the former governor who had spent more money and gotten less results for it and had engaged in more corrupt activities than any other administration in the state. We battled that fight out all during the summer of 1962. When I entered the race, the county unit system was intact. Everything was just like it had been for years. After we got into the race, about 2 or 3 months into the campaign, the Supreme Court threw out the county unit system, which was something that was unforeseen by me or him or anybody else. And we finished the race on a popular vote basis rather than the county vote, county unit system. I won that campaign, though, if you counted county units, if you counted popular votes, if you just counted white votes, or you just counted black votes. I won it across the board on any way that you counted it. It was a very, very exciting period in my life. It was, at that point, I, had just suddenly realized what a large state we had, how many counties that we had, how many civic clubs that we had, how many campaign trips that you had to make, how much money you had to spend. It was an enormous undertaking. It was something that was very revealing to me, and something, of course, I'll always remember, and something that fortunately turned out well for me, and I was elected, the 74th, I think it was, governor of the state of Georgia.
How difficult was fundraising for you in that campaign?
Well, it was very difficult until it became fairly obvious that I was going to win the race. Now, when I first started out, it was very difficult fundraising. I had one good man in my corner who had previously been for Garland Byrd, and that was Mills B. Lane, who was the chairman of the board of the CNS Bank. I went to see Mills Lane and asked him if he would support me. He had previously been committed to Garland Byrd. He had decided for reasons of his own prior to my going there, I'd heard that he wasn't going to support Byrd, and he agreed that he would support me. Well, that I didn't know what that meant, but I later found out, of course, that there were business people in the state that because of Mills Lane's willingness to support me, that felt like that I had enough of a chance that they would support me. I'd gotten my friend J.B. Fuqua, who back in those days was my client and who had a local television station there in Augusta, to sort of be the campaign treasurer, and we started out on a very, I guess you'd call it a shoestring, and we got enough money we raised money locally in Augusta, and then we raised some money out in the state, like I said, and of course about a month before the election was to be held, not to my surprise, but well, I guess it was to my surprise, a lot of people, of course, began to send checks in that I'd never heard of. They were obviously becoming aware of the fact that they thought I was going to win. I think for a long time there, people didn't think I had much of a chance to beat the former governor of the state. But Lewis Harris, the pollster, that was in his early days, he'd been commissioned by CBS or somebody, and they picked me up about a month, 2 or 3 weeks before the election, photographing and everything else, and I asked them what they were doing, and they said they were, making this film and all for CBS. I said, well, what makes you think I'm going to win? And they said, well, we made a poll and we think you're going to win. And I said, well, I don't know anything about political polls. That was before anybody really started using them. I said, you may think I'm going to win, but I don't know whether I'm going to win or not. You fellas just get out of my way, because I'm going to campaign as hard as I can every day, but I assure you that I don't have the foggiest idea as to whether I'm going to win. Their poll came out within about a point of what they had polled at that time, so it convinced me later that political polling was something to be taken seriously.
How important was TV in that campaign?
TV was very important. TV back in that day and time, that was in the early years of TV. We didn't have teleprompters. We didn't have videotapes. Our television was done live. We still had, barbecues. We still had campaign events right out there without television. I mean, the television coverage basically was in the studios. But you'd go in the studios and you'd either cut a 5-minute or 15-minute, or back in those days you could even buy 30 minutes of television time. Today, 30 minutes, gosh knows what it would cost. I remember I had a couple of programs. One of them I had some legislators that I'd served with on a program. I thought it was a 15-minute program. We got on there, got through 15 minutes, and the director held up his hand, and 15 more minutes. Well, I'd run out of material, but I didn't know what, so I started calling them back, and next thing I knew, I'd gotten them back out there, and we talked about other things. The program turned out pretty well. But in those days, they turned on the camera. You saw the red light come on. You were there just totally with you and the television audience. And if you stuttered or you muttered or you went blank, that was just tough luck, because everybody in the television audience would sit right there and look at you, and you couldn't, if you made a mistake, you couldn't say, well, stop the tape, I want to tape that over again, and we'll redo that, or give me a teleprompter so I can read the teleprompter. You didn't have that.
Of course, nowadays campaigning is very expensive, but do you have any idea what your total campaign costs were at that time?
Oh, yeah, I think even back in that day and time, we spent probably $1 million, close to it. I say $1 million. First go around, maybe it wasn't $1 million. Maybe it was several $100,000. In 1970, we spent a couple of $1 million about.
Of course, in the campaign, the Griffin record, I guess, was the biggest issue of all. But what other themes did you stress?
Well, I stressed industrial development. I stressed education, which became really the I guess the cornerstone of my administration. I stressed a lot of things like that, but really, like you say, we got into the honesty in government, the corruption thing, which was another thing I stressed. Of course, honesty in government, appointing good people, living in the 20th century, not trying to retrogress back into the dark ages, which of course is some of the things that Griffin and some of his people were.
That campaign has been called one of the dirtiest and bitterest in Georgia's history. Do you agree with that assessment?
No, I don't think that one was as rough and dirty as the one in 1970.
We'll get to that one shortly. Who were your closest political advisors in 1962?
Well, in that campaign, as it progressed along, my campaign manager was a friend of mine from down in Thompson, Georgia, Wick Knox, who was, he'd been chairman of the School Board Association. Mr. Jim Gillis came into the campaign at some point because he was not a Marvin Griffin man. He was on the outside looking in, so he wound up over in my campaign. J.B. Fuqua, of course, was in my campaign advisory group. Doug Bernard, who later became my executive secretary, and a few other. We didn't have a what you'd call a big group of advisors. Mills Lane was helping me standpoint around Atlanta. But when you think about it, I think about it from the standpoint of number of people that were involved in that, they were sort of few and far between.
Okay, as governor, it appears that education was your top priority. And unlike Governor Harris, you were even willing to raise taxes to improve Georgia's schools. Why did you consider education so important?
Well, I guess I considered it so important because I realized in my own life that had I not had the opportunity to go to college and to get an education, a good education, that I probably would never have been able to have achieved the office of governor or any other, or my profession as a lawyer. I went to school, as I said, in the public schools, and I went to college on a football scholarship, and then I finished on a serviceman's pension, or whatever you want to call it, the GI Bill of Rights. And I knew that I had been fortunate, but I knew there were thousands and thousands of other young people in this state that would never have that opportunity. Maybe they couldn't play football. Certainly they wouldn't have to go to war in order to get an opportunity to go to college. And I also knew that Georgia was still very close to the bottom of the list in the educational criteria, and that if this state was ever going to really achieve its destiny and become a great place in which to live and a great place for other people to come here and to be a part of it, we were going to have to improve the quality of our basic educational systems, elementary, secondary, and of course the graduate and postgraduate systems of education in this state.
Of course, improving education meant not only spending more money, but also reforming the system. What were some of the most important educational reforms adopted in your administration?
Well, we did a lot of things. Of course, we did basic things. We changed some of the method of allocating funds. We also improved the teacher-pupil ratio. We built vocational technical schools all over the state. I created and put into effect the public educational television system. I also created 10 or 12 junior colleges, and also converted 2 or 3 junior colleges into 4-year community colleges, which we hadn't had before. and we created many postgraduate degrees and things in the higher system of education that had never been available in a lot of the units of the university system. So we really did, we just sort of completely revamped the whole educational system of the state, and built buildings and facilities to a far greater extent than we'd ever done before. We consolidated a lot of schools. We just did everything you can think of.
Another priority in your administration.
Raised the teacher salaries, I might add, and the college faculty salaries tremendously, which of course attracted many people.
Another priority was the attempt to make Georgia's government operate more efficiently.
Yeah.
In this area, the Bowden Commission must have played the pivotal role.
It
How
did.
it
We
function?
set up the Bowden Commission, which was headed by Bill Bowden, and there was 7 or 8 other very top-flight distinguished business people that we put on that commission. And I brought them into the government. They sort of was sort of a outgrowth of a committee that I had served on one time when I was in legislature, the Committee on Efficiency and Economy in Government. I brought them in because I realized that when I became governor that it was impossible for me to run the state and at the same time go over and either evaluate myself or get department heads to evaluate themselves and make major changes and improvements in the operation of government. By creating this commission, giving them funds, allowing them to employ consultants, allowing them to go into the various departments of state government, make an analysis of how that department was being run and how they might improve upon its operation through some consultation with some experts and all. It gave me the opportunity then to sit down with the department head and say to him, look, do you want to go ahead and do this because this is something that will be good for you and good for the state, or do you want me to go ahead and have this commission do it, which in turn, if you resist it, it's not going to be good for you, it's not going to be good for the state. And in every case, without question, where I use that committee as my alter ego to go in and do the spade work and come back and show me and give me a report on how things could be improved and how we could operate things more efficiently and all, I was able to get the departments themselves to go ahead and implement the recommendations. We did it in prison reform, we did it in the revenue department, we did it in the merit system, we just did it in the highway department, we did it in every major department of state government, the parks department, everything. We reformed and reorganized and improved the effectiveness and the productivity and the efficiency of those departments, and I think really laid the cornerstone for tremendous quantum jump in progress in this state in the operation of our state government.
Did the Bowden Commission make any major recommendations that you disagreed with?
Not that I recall. Not that I recall. I don't remember having any major disagreement with them on anything.
At the end of your term, you advised your successor to establish a similar commission. Do you now think it would be advisable for every administration to have a commission similar to the Bowden Commission?
I do, definitely. I think it's the finest way in the world for the governor to be able to make some real major progressive steps without a commission. I don't think you can do that. I just don't think that you have the time, nor do you have the ability yourself to do these major studies and major evaluations without having an independent commission who can go in there under your sponsorship, under the sponsorship of the governor, and really be doing the job for you that you cannot do individually in a period of 4 years or even a period of 8 years now. I don't think they can do it in that period of time.
You seem to value the work of study commissions since you created several of them. Were commissions such as the Governor's Commission on the Status of Women, the Governor's Council on Physical Fitness, largely window dressing, or did they perform a valuable service?
They performed a very valuable service. The Governor's Commission on the Status of Women, I think, of course, has continued for many years. The Governor's Honors Program that I created for the real talented and exceptional high school students. It goes on. It's a wonderful program. The Governor's Council on Physical Fitness was a valuable program at the time. We had recreational departments all throughout Georgia that put in those volunteer programs, and they were very valuable. The Governor's Commission to Improve Education, which of course was one of the first commissions that I set up to get right into the major educational reforms my first year in government. The Bowden Commission, all of those commissions that I used, I used them not as window dressing, but I used them as effective aids and tools in helping me better carry out my responsibility as the chief executive of the state.
Another commission which clearly did serve a useful purpose was the Constitutional Revision Commission.
Constitutional Revision Commission served a very useful purpose. They did a very good job. Of course, without a Constitutional Revision Commission, you have only other alternative you have is a constitutional convention. And of course, when you open up the revision of the Constitution to a convention where people are elected and there's no telling who they might be or what kind of qualifications they have, you really put yourself in a position where there's not anything you can come out of a convention with, in my opinion, except a lot of chaos and confusion. I set up the Constitutional Revision Commission. That commission made a report to me. They worked hard for a year or so. They made a report to me. I, in turn, then called a special session of the General Assembly. That was the toughest job I think I've ever done in government, and that was to get the Constitution adopted, the revised Constitution, and at the same time also adopt a complete revision of all the election laws in the state of Georgia, which we did in the summer of 1965. Out of a blue sky, there came the federal court filed by a lawsuit filed by somebody. I've forgotten who now. But anyway, they determined that the General Assembly of Georgia was malapportioned, and that because of it being malapportioned, the court ruled that the constitutional revision that had taken place that summer could not and should not be allowed to be placed on the ballot for the general election. I, of course, at the same time, they permitted all of the revision of the election laws to be put on the statute books and be considered to be perfectly valid. Well, that was sort of ludicrous to me as to how one body could pass laws that concerned elections and be declared valid, and on the other hand, any law that had to do with revising the Constitution would be declared unconstitutional. So we appealed that. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decision, which came down later and said that the federal court had been wrong, came down at a time where it was too late to get it on the ballot, and so all of that work for constitutional revision that had been done was sort of put aside. I think later, when in subsequent administrations, when they finally got around to constitutional amendments and revisions, that much of that work, of course, was subsequently used in the ultimate adoption of a new constitution. But Georgia's constitution at the time that I rewrote it was in such a state of absolute uncertainty and complete disarray that nobody knew. There was no place where you could go and sit down and read a document that contained the entire Constitution of Georgia, because it's been amended thousands of times. Many of those amendments were just completely inconsistent with each other, and it just did not exist in a form where you could have good constitutional government. So although I was deprived of the satisfaction of having a new constitution adopted, I did pass a new constitution through the General Assembly, and I subsequently proved to my satisfaction that the court should have allowed that to have been adopted by the people. And I did everything I could to try to bring that about, but it didn't happen.
Was the failure to adopt this Constitution your biggest disappointment as governor?
I think it was. The fact that I worked so hard on it, and it had gotten it through the General Assembly and gotten it approved by 2/3 of the members of the House of the Senate, had it ready for submission to the people, felt like the people would have adopted it, and then to have a federal court take it away from you and take it away wrongfully was probably the biggest disappointment I had.
I would imagine in that special session there was tremendous pressure to change various aspects of the Constitution.
Everything in the world they attempted to change, including the Bill of Rights and even the preface to the Constitution. I think they debated the Bill of Rights for 2 or 3 days, and everything else. I never saw such a number of efforts to change everything you could think of in the Constitution. Of course, there were also a lot of efforts not to change anything because people had lived with certain words in certain industries and businesses, said, well, we know how the courts have already interpreted the provision that affects us, so we don't want to change a period or a comma. We just want to leave it like it is. So it was a very, very tough, hard-fought battle to put it together. And after we got it together and then got it passed, and not to have it put on the ballot was something that was a disappointment.
By and large, the new Constitution would have provided clarity in government.
Would have simplified, it would have provided clarity, it would have given more home rule than we previously had. It would have eliminated a lot of the confusing amendments. The method by which you could amend the Constitution would have been simplified. There was just a number of things. It would have allowed the thing to be put together in one document that people could read and understand.
But at the same time, it would not have changed the system in a fundamental way. For example, the number of counties remained the same.
No, we couldn't do that. I knew that was at that point. It did, however, and we passed a constitutional amendment that would have allowed, and still does allow, a consolidation of counties. I put that amendment through while I was governor, that where counties wanted to come together and consolidate their governments, that they can do that under our constitutional provision now, which was passed while I was governor.
Mm-hmm. Your administration fared better with the federal courts on the issue of reapportionment.
Well, we fared well with them because we took the responsibility of reapportionment to both the congressional districts, the Georgia Senate, and the House of Representatives. We did all three. We reapportioned all three of those bodies while I was governor of Georgia. We did it within the framework of our own state government, and we were never required to do anything or have the federal court do it themselves, like was being done in states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. States all around us, the legislatures just threw up their hands and said, we can't do this, we're going to quit, we'll let the courts do it. The courts stepped in and reapportioned a lot of the legislative bodies. I refused to accept that. I said that, look, we are elected officials, we are supposed to be responsible, we are the leaders of the state. We certainly ought to be able to do this job without letting a bunch of federal judges do it. I saw a lot of members of the General Assembly stand up and vote for legislative reapportionment, knowing that by doing that they were voting themselves out of office and they would not be able to return. That really was a courageous thing for me to see them do, and it restored my faith in human nature, because I realized that when people are given a fundamental job and responsibility is something that's they know that's right and they have to do, that they'll step up and do that, even though they may not. It might be distasteful to them. It might be something that's repugnant to them. But in they had to do to reapportion the states so that the voting of the members of the Assembly was within the acceptable tolerances permitted by the Supreme Court of the United States.
Redoing the congressional districts at the end of the 1964 session was a hectic experience.
Traumatic experience. That's when we stopped the clock. We went on into the wee hours of the morning. That's when Denmark Groover, who had been Marvin Griffin's floor leader and who was a friend of mine, but who was opposed to any plan at that time, got up in the balcony and pulled the clock off of the wall and smashed it to the floor when everybody in the General Assembly was sitting around with crayons and maps and were drawing districts up. Tick Forrester was a congressman from down in southernmost district of Georgia. He had decided in his own mind to retire, but he didn't tell us that. So many of his people, legislators from his district, were fighting to preserve his seat. Carl Vinson later retired from, the middle district of Georgia, and
Excuse me, we asked you to let you know about the Greensboro again.
Carl Vinson was also going to retire. He didn't let anybody know that either, so we had just a knockdown, drag-out fight over Jack Flint's district, how they were going to divide it up. They took his district, and I think it was a 7 back then, but anyway, they took it and split it up and put Macon in it, and he opposed that. Later turned out to be the best thing ever happened to him, kept him in the Congress for probably several more terms that he wouldn't have stayed in there otherwise. But we had bitter battles, and the truth of the matter is we passed that night, we really passed a map that had been agreed upon, and between the time that we shut down the General Assembly, which is probably 2 o'clock in the morning, and about 8 the next morning, we drafted a bill that would conform to that map so that when the clerk's office opened the next morning, we would have a piece of legislation that not only had a map, but it had a bill attached to it. Now, that's a terrible way to pass a law, but that's the only way we could pass the reapportionment of the congressional districts for the state of Georgia. The old saying is there are 2 things that you should never watch being made. One is laws, and the other one's sausage. And I agree with that, because when you see it sometimes you think, how in the world can those people be making laws in the fashion that they're making them? But that's the way some laws are made. That's the way some things happen. That was a momentous time in the history of Georgia. That's the way we reapportioned the congressional district.
At the conclusion of the 1986 legislative session, the House and Senate adjourned prematurely without completing some major bills. And I immediately thought of your administration and the role you played in this particular issue, working with the legislature right up to the very end. It seems like there's quite a difference in gubernatorial styles.
Well, I think the whole system's changed. I think back in my day and time, it would be unthinkable for the General Assembly of Georgia to adjourn without the governor not only knowing about it, but without the governor agreeing as to the time they were going to adjourn and whether they had accomplished their legislative agenda. To me, it's unthinkable and unbelievable that a General Assembly today could go home and notify the governor that they had adjourned and him not even be aware of it. But that was the scenario according to what the governor said and what the newspaper said this year. I think it again proves to me that our system has changed from one of a strong executive running the state to where now the General Assembly is actually performing the duties of chief executive officer more so than the governor is. You want to stop and let me see them, and we'll